Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The sounds coming from the ocean floor are getting louder. The hydrophone array didn't just activate at 3:47 a.m. It screamed like something dying in the dark. Dr. David Kellerman's coffee mug shattered against the concrete wall as he ripped the headphones from his ears, but the damage was already done. The sound had burrowed into his skull like a parasite, a bone-deep thrumming that seemed to originate from the molten core of the earth itself. His hands trembled violently as he stared at the audio readouts cascading across his monitors. The frequencies were so low they existed in a realm beyond human hearing, yet somehow they bypassed his ears entirely and spoke directly to the ancient reptilian parts of his brain that still remembered what it meant to cower in caves while apex predators stalked the darkness outside. The sound pulsed again, and every piece of equipment in the Monterey Bay Deep Ocean Research Station vibrated in perfect, terrifying harmony. Coffee sloshed from forgotten mugs onto sensitive electronics. Pencils rolled off desks in synchronized waves. The building's steel framework hummed like a massive tuning fork struck by something that existed beyond the normal laws of physics. Kellerman's breath came in short, panicked gasps as his eyes locked onto the depth readings that defied everything he thought he knew about the deep ocean. 7 miles down in the Challenger Deep of the Mariana Trench, in a place where the pressure should have crushed any conceivable form of life into component atoms, something had just announced its presence to the surface world. He replayed the recording with a desperate hope that he'd made some catastrophic error in his measurements, his finger hovering over the volume control like a man preparing to touch molten metal. The sound built slowly this time, starting as a whisper that made his molars ache and crescendoing into a pulse that felt like being swallowed alive by something vast and patient and utterly alien. But it wasn't random. There was intelligence woven through every frequency, purpose embedded in every harmonic. A deliberate rhythm that spoke of consciousness operating on scales that human minds weren't equipped to comprehend. David? Jesus Christ, what in God's name is that noise? Dr. Rita Valdez stood frozen in the doorway like a deer caught in headlights, her keys still clutched in white-knuckled fingers that had gone numb with instinctive terror. She'd arrived 4 hours early, driven by the same inexplicable unease that had kept him chained to his monitoring station through the endless night. Her usually composed face was corpse pale, eyes wide with the kind of primal fear that millions of years of evolution couldn't shake. "I don't know what it is," Kellerman whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of silent, mounting dread. "But Rita, it's massive. Bigger than anything that should be able to exist at those depths." He gestured with a trembling hand toward the acoustic displacement readings that painted an impossible picture across his screens. The numbers mocked every law of marine biology that he'd spent 20 years studying. Something the size of downtown Manhattan was moving through water that should have been as empty and lifeless as the vacuum between stars. Rita stepped closer on legs that felt like water, her scientific training locked in mortal combat with the primitive terror that screamed at her to run as far and as fast as humanly possible. Seismic activity, underwater volcanic eruption. No seismic readings anywhere in the Pacific Ring of Fire. No electromagnetic signatures that correspond to geological activity. Nothing on sonar arrays that makes even the slightest bit of sense. Kellerman's bloodshot eyes hadn't left his monitors in over 12 hours, and they burned with the intensity of a man staring into the abyss. I've run every diagnostic protocol we have, cross-referenced with geological surveys going back 70 years. Whatever made that sound, Rita, it doesn't exist in any database on Earth. The speakers crackled to life again without warning, and both scientists flinched backward as the thrumming returned with doubled intensity. This time it lasted nearly 45 seconds of deep, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to sync perfectly with their racing heartbeats, as if something in the crushing darkness 7 miles below was monitoring their cardiovascular responses in real time. As the sound faded into a silence that felt pregnant with malevolent possibility, Rita noticed something that turned her blood to ice water in her veins. "David, look at your coffee spill." The dark liquid pooled on his desk was vibrating in perfect, expanding circles, tiny ripples moving outward in precise synchronization with the fading audio signature. But what made her knees buckle with terror was the realization that the ripples were still moving, still pulsing with metronomic precision, long after the sound had supposedly stopped. "It's not just acoustic," she breathed, her voice barely audible above the sudden roaring in her ears. "Whatever's making those sounds, it's generating vibrations that are traveling through solid rock, through the continental shelf itself." Kellerman nodded grimly, his face taking on the grey pallor of a man who'd glimpsed his own mortality. He pulled up additional monitoring stations across his vast array of screens, each one telling the same impossible story. Mariana Trench reported the same signature 2 hours and 17 minutes ago. Puerto Rico Trench 63 minutes after that. Japan Trench 38 minutes ago. Kermadec Trench 12 minutes ago. He overlaid the detection times on a three-dimensional map of the Pacific Basin, showing how the signals had propagated across thousands of miles of ocean floor with the precision of a military communications network. The pattern was too perfect to be natural, too coordinated to be anything but deliberate. "They're not just connected," Rita said, her voice barely a whisper of sound. "They're communicating, all of them, at the same time." "Not communicating," Kellerman corrected, and the distinction hit her like a physical blow to the solar plexus. "Coordinating." Communication implied intelligence. Coordination implied organization, hierarchy, purpose that extended beyond individual consciousness into something resembling civilization. The implications crashed over Rita like a tsunami of existential terror. Kellerman began playing the recordings in chronological sequence, and the truth that emerged was more terrifying than either of them had prepared for. The sounds weren't random calls echoing through the endless dark of the deep ocean. They were responses, conversations conducted in frequencies that made human bone marrow vibrate and teeth loosen in their sockets. Back and forth across the entire Pacific Basin, something vast and ancient was coordinating with others of its kind in a language that predated human speech by geological ages. "How many distinct voices?" Rita asked, though part of her mind was screaming that she didn't want to know the answer. 23 confirmed acoustic signatures so far, all from depths exceeding 15,000 feet, all following identical harmonic patterns that suggest shared linguistic structures. His fingers flew across the keyboard with manic precision, pulling up bathymetric charts overlaid with sound propagation models that revealed the true scope of their discovery. "But look at this, Rita. Look at how they're using the ocean floor itself." The display showed how the acoustic signals traveled along underwater mountain ranges and trench systems, following the topology of the seafloor with the efficiency of fiber optic cables. The precision was staggering, requiring intimate knowledge of every ridge, every seamount, every geological feature spanning the entire Pacific Rim. "This level of acoustic coordination," Rita said slowly, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing, "would require detailed maps of ocean floor geology covering millions of square miles. Maps that would take centuries to compile through direct observation," Kellerman agreed, his voice hollow with the weight of realization. "Or something that's been down there long enough to survey every inch personally. Something that's had time to turn the entire Pacific Basin into its own private communication network." The implication hung between them like a malevolent presence, poisoning the air they breathed. Something unimaginably ancient had been living in the deepest parts of their world. Something that had spent eons quietly cataloguing the ocean's secrets while humanity was still learning to make fire and huddle together for warmth against the darkness. Over the next 18 hours, they watched their understanding of reality crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. The sounds continued at precisely timed intervals, each transmission growing exponentially louder with a mathematical progression that violated every law of underwater acoustics that Kellerman had spent his career studying. "The amplitude increases are impossible," he muttered, staring at volume readings that climbed steadily upward, despite originating from sources thousands of miles away. Sound waves should dissipate over distance, not gain strength. It's like the water itself is acting as an amplification medium. Rita had been trying desperately to contact other research stations, but the responses she received only confirmed their growing nightmare. Deep-sea monitoring facilities from the Scripps Institution in California to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts were detecting identical signals. Marine biologists in Japan reported mass whale beachings along a 1,000-mile stretch of coastline, the animals fleeing the water with the desperation of creatures escaping a forest fire. Seismologists in Chile were baffled by phantom earthquakes that registered on their most sensitive instruments, but showed no corresponding ground movement. "Every marine mammal with functioning ears is going insane," Rita reported after her latest conversation with panicked colleagues. "Dolphins are beaching themselves in groups of hundreds. Whales are diving to depths that should kill them, trying to escape something they can hear, but we can't properly detect." "We can detect it," Kellerman said quietly, his eyes reflecting the blue glow of his monitors like pools of stagnant water. "We just don't want to accept what we're detecting." As if summoned by his words, the speakers erupted with a transmission unlike anything they'd recorded before. Multiple voices joined in a harmony that seemed to originate from inside their skulls, creating overtones and harmonic frequencies that bypassed the ear entirely and resonated through the cerebrospinal fluid that bathed their brains. Kellerman grabbed his headphones with hands that shook like autumn leaves, his face contorting in agony as he tried to isolate the individual frequency components. Jesus, there are dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all synchronized, all following the same melodic progression. It's like a choir performing a composition that's been rehearsed for millennia. "A choir of what?" Rita asked, though she was no longer sure she wanted to hear the answer. Before Kellerman could respond, every piece of electronic equipment in the station flickered in perfect unison. The lights dimmed to an amber glow. Computer screens went black for 30 heart-stopping seconds before rebooting, with displays that showed readings they had never seen before. Temperature sensors registered impossible thermal variations in the deep water. Pressure gauges indicated fluctuations that shouldn't exist at those depths. For those 30 seconds of electronic darkness, they stood in near total silence while something in the deepest trenches of the Pacific Ocean sang with voices that made the fundamental constants of reality seem negotiable rather than absolute. When the power stabilized and their instruments came back online, Kellerman was staring at his depth readings with an expression of pure, crystallized horror. "Rita," he whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice over deep water. "They're moving." She looked over his shoulder and felt her legs turn to liquid beneath her. The acoustic sources weren't stationary anymore. Across the entire Pacific Basin, from the Mariana Trench to the Peru-Chile Trench, from the Aleutian Deep to the Tonga Trench, the signals were rising through the water column with the inexorable patience of geological processes made animate. "That can't be right," she said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Check your calibration. Run the diagnostics again." But the numbers didn't change. In 18 hours, the sources had risen nearly 3,000 feet from their original positions. At their current rate of ascent, they would reach the photic zone, the shallow waters where sunlight could still penetrate within 72 hours. "We need to evacuate every coastal city from Alaska to Chile," Rita said, reaching for the emergency communication system with hands that moved like they belonged to someone else. "Alert the Navy, the Coast Guard, NOAA, everyone with the authority to coordinate a large-scale emergency response." "And tell them what, exactly?" Kellerman's laugh was the sound of sanity, fracturing under pressure. "That something the size of a metropolitan area is rising from the bottom of the ocean? That we're about to make first contact with a civilization that's been living in our world since before complex life evolved on land? That everything we thought we knew about Earth's oceans was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong?" But Rita was already dialing numbers, her scientific training providing a thin veneer of purpose over the expanding void of terror that threatened to swallow her whole. Someone had to warn people, even if the warning sounded like the ravings of minds broken by isolation and impossible discoveries. The response was exactly what she'd expected and dreaded. Polite dismissals from bureaucrats who'd never spent a night alone with the deep ocean's secrets. Requests for peer review and confirmation from colleagues who couldn't conceive of data that challenged their fundamental assumptions about marine biology. Demands for evidence that could be independently verified by people who'd never heard sounds that came from places where no life should exist. The next 72 hours became a descent into a waking nightmare that would have broken stronger minds than theirs. Dr. Elizabeth Harper arrived from Woods Hole on an emergency charter flight, her usually unflappable demeanor shattered by the preliminary recordings Kellerman had transmitted to her secure server. She found him in the station's sub-basement, surrounded by jury-rigged audio, equipment that turned the concrete chamber into a makeshift cathedral of electronic monitoring. Banks of speakers lined the walls, each one tuned to different frequency ranges and connected to hydrophones positioned at various depths throughout Monterey Canyon. The effect was overwhelming. A surround sound environment that made it impossible to escape the voices rising from the deep. "David, you look like hell," Harper said, noting the sleeping bag crumpled in the corner and the forest of empty energy drink cans that surrounded his workstation, like the detritus of a caffeine-fueled religious vigil. "Can't sleep," he mumbled without looking away from his monitors, his bloodshot eyes tracking acoustic waveforms with the intensity of a mystic reading sacred texts. They're most active during the deep night hours when surface noise is minimal. Every transmission contains new information about their coordinated movement patterns. If I miss a sequence, we might lose critical intelligence about their intentions. Harper studied the man who had once been her most promising graduate student. His hair was greasy and unkempt, his clothes unchanged for days and stained with spilled coffee and the nervous sweat of perpetual terror. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of exhaustion so profound it had moved beyond physical fatigue into the realm of spiritual depletion. "What kind of intentions? You still don't have any concrete evidence about what these acoustic sources actually are." "But I'm decoding their communication protocols," he said with an intensity that made Harper take an involuntary step backward. "The frequency modulations aren't random or instinctive. There's syntax, grammar, recursive linguistic structures that indicate abstract reasoning capabilities. They're not just coordinating movement, Elizabeth. They're sharing detailed information about surface conditions, human activities, technological capabilities." He gestured towards a spectrographic analysis that covered 3 wall-mounted monitors, showing how the acoustic patterns had evolved exponentially in complexity over the past week. What had begun as simple pulse sequences had developed into intricate symphonies of meaning, layered compositions that referenced and built upon earlier transmissions with the sophistication of a university-level discourse. "They're discussing shipping routes," Kellerman continued, his voice growing more excited and manic with each revelation. Commercial fishing operations, military submarine patrol patterns, underwater cable installations. Every time a surface vessel passes over one of their positions, the conversations spike with what can only be described as analytical commentary. Harper felt a chill that penetrated through her bones and settled in her marrow. "You're suggesting these things are conducting surveillance on human activities?" "I'm stating as a matter of documented fact that they've been conducting systematic reconnaissance of our entire technological civilization. The ocean floor topology they're using for their communication network includes geological features that were formed during the Mesozoic era. Elizabeth, these entities have been down there for 65 million years, watching and learning and preparing for something we can't even begin to comprehend." That night, Rita found him standing waist-deep in the storm-churned surf outside the research station, his clothes soaked and clinging to his skeletal frame, while he stared towards the dark horizon with the expression of a prophet receiving visions of the apocalypse. The hurricane that had been building in the Pacific for days was finally making landfall, sending 20-foot swells crashing against the rocky coastline with the rhythm of a giant's heartbeat. "David, what the hell are you doing out here?" she called over the howling wind, wading into the frigid water with the desperate urgency of someone trying to talk a jumper down from a bridge. "Can you feel them through the water?" he asked without turning to acknowledge her presence, his voice eerily calm despite the chaos of wind and waves around them. The vibrations travel through the continental shelf, up through the bedrock beneath our feet, through the foundation of the building itself. They're not contained to the ocean anymore. Rita, they're in the earth, in the air, in the electromagnetic spectrum we use for our communications. She grabbed his arm, alarmed by his vacant expression and the way he swayed with each massive wave that threatened to drag him into the deeper water. His skin was ice cold, his lips blue with hypothermia that he seemed completely unaware of. "You're going to die of exposure if you stay out here. Come back inside where it's warm and dry." "They know we're monitoring them," he continued as she hauled him toward shore, his voice taking on the sing-song quality of someone reciting a catechism learned through repetition and obsession. "The transmission patterns modulate in direct response to our research activities. When I replay their recordings, they respond with variations that reference the specific segments I've been analyzing. When my stress levels spike, their acoustic signatures become more agitated, more complex, as if they're feeding off human emotional states." Rita managed to drag him back to the safety of the beach, but his words followed her into her dreams that night. Alone in her apartment 20 miles inland, she began to understand what Kellerman meant about the sounds traveling through solid matter. They came to her in sleep as deep thrumming that seemed to emanate from the bedrock beneath her building, growing louder each time she jolted awake in a cold sweat of primal terror. By morning, she could feel them during her waking hours as well, a subsonic pulse that made her coffee mug dance on the kitchen table and caused inexplicable vibrations in the walls of her second-floor apartment. The sounds were spreading inland, following geological formations and underground water systems with the persistence of a slow-moving plague. The breaking point came during the hurricane's peak, when Category 4 winds had forced the evacuation of all non-essential personnel and left Kellerman alone in the research station with his banks of monitoring equipment and his growing obsession with the voices from the deep. The building groaned and shuddered as 140-mile-per-hour gusts tried to rip it from its foundations, but he barely registered the terrestrial storm raging around him. His attention was focused entirely on readings that documented the acceleration of something far more catastrophic than any mere atmospheric disturbance. The acoustic sources were no longer rising gradually through the water column. What had been a steady ascent measured in hundreds of feet per day had become a rapid climb that could be tracked in real time. More terrifying still, New signatures were appearing on his instruments with increasing frequency, smaller contacts rising from trenches and abyssal plains that hadn't shown any activity before, as if his original discoveries had been issuing a general mobilization order to others of their kind scattered throughout the world's oceans. No, 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 he muttered, frantically recalibrating instruments that continued to report the same impossible data. This can't be happening this fast. But the numbers were consistent across every monitoring station that remained operational. The things in the deep were no longer content to remain hidden in the crushing darkness of the ocean floor. Whatever ancient patience had kept them in the depths for millions of years had finally been exhausted. Current depth readings showed the primary contacts at 2,000 feet below sea level and rising at an accelerating rate. Kellerman grabbed his emergency radio, cycling through frequencies in a desperate attempt to reach the Coast Guard, the Navy, NOAA, anyone with the authority and resources to coordinate the evacuation of every coastal population center on the Pacific Rim. But the hurricane had knocked out most communication systems, and those that remained operational dismissed his increasingly frantic reports as the delusions of a man who'd spent too many days alone with his instruments while a major storm battered his isolation into fragments of paranoid fantasy. At 1,500 feet depth, Kellerman finally understood the true purpose behind everything he'd been documenting for the past week. The rhythmic pulses that had seemed like communication, the coordinated timing across vast distances, the way the acoustic signatures seemed to map every feature of the ocean floor with impossible precision. None of it had been random or instinctive. It had been echolocation. Something unimaginably vast had been using the entire Pacific Ocean as a sensing system, sending out acoustic pulses that bounced off every surface from the deepest abyssal trenches to the shallowest coastal waters. Every ship that had ever sailed the Pacific, every submarine that had ever dove beneath its surface, every piece of underwater infrastructure that human civilization had ever constructed, all of it had been catalogued and analysed with the methodical precision that a bat uses to navigate through absolute darkness. The revelation struck him with such force that he doubled over his console, his stomach clenching with nausea as the full implications crashed through his consciousness like a tsunami of existential terror. These entities hadn't been hiding in the deep ocean or living secret lives in Earth's most inaccessible places. They had been conducting a comprehensive survey of human civilization, mapping every detail of surface activity with the patient thoroughness of scientists studying bacteria in a petri dish. And now, having completed their analysis of the small, noisy creatures that lived on the thin film of water covering their world, they were rising to make direct contact with their subjects. At 1,000 feet depth, the hydrophone array beneath the research station activated with a sound that didn't just break every speaker in the building. It shattered windows, cracked concrete, and sent seismic shockwaves radiating inland with the force of a moderate earthquake. Kellerman was thrown to his knees as the thrumming pulse came from directly below, so powerful that it liquefied the sand beneath the building's foundation and sent the entire structure swaying like a ship in heavy seas. Through the storm-lashed windows, he watched the impossible unfold before his disbelieving eyes. The ocean surface, which should have been a chaotic maelstrom of 40-foot waves driven by hurricane-force winds, began to rise in smooth, perfectly geometrical domes that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. Water that had been following the laws of physics since the formation of the solar system suddenly moved with purpose and intelligence, lifting in patterns that suggested something incomprehensibly large was reshaping the very structure of the ocean from below. The waves didn't crash or break. They simply rose higher and higher, forming impossible architecture out of liquid that should have been governed by gravity and wind resistance. But it wasn't just one dome. As lightning illuminated the supernatural chaos outside, Kellerman could see dozens of similar formations across Monterey Bay, each one centered over deep water channels, where his instruments had detected the strongest acoustic signatures. The The sea itself was being displaced by entities so massive that entire oceanic systems were being reorganized around their presence like iron filings, aligning with a magnetic field. At 500 feet depth, new contacts began appearing on his instruments faster than he could catalogue them. Not just the primary entities rising from the deepest trenches, but smaller forms, though smaller, was a relative term when dealing with things that dwarf blue whales the way blue whales dwarfed krill. These new arrivals were ascending from mid-ocean ridges, underwater mountain ranges, and continental shelf formations that Kellerman had never suspected might harbour life. The Pacific was waking up, and everything that lived in its depths was rising toward the surface in a coordinated emergence that spoke of planning and preparation, spanning geological ages. At 100 feet depth, the sounds changed completely. What had been thrumming pulses became something else entirely, a harmony of voices so complex and alien that Kellerman's instruments couldn't properly analyze the frequency components. The sounds seemed to bypass the normal mechanisms of hearing and resonate directly through the electromagnetic fields generated by his nervous system. He could feel the voices in his bones, in his blood, in the bioelectric charges that allowed his neurons to fire. Whatever was rising from the depths wasn't just communicating through sound anymore. It was interfacing directly with the fundamental processes that sustained life itself. Then, in a moment that shattered his remaining connection to sanity, the sounds stopped completely. The sudden silence was more terrifying than any noise could have been. Kellerman staggered to his feet, on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, his ears ringing in the complete absence of the thrumming that had become as constant as his own heartbeat over the past week. Outside, the hurricane continued to rage with undiminished fury, but the ocean had gone unnaturally calm. The impossible domes of displaced water held their positions like liquid mountains, waiting for some signal that only they could perceive. Kellerman fumbled for his emergency recording equipment with hands that shook so violently it took multiple attempts to activate the device. Whatever happened next needed to be documented, preserved for whoever might someday find the wreckage of human civilization and wonder what had gone wrong. "This is Dr. David Kellerman at Monterey Bay Deep Ocean Research Station," he began, his voice barely recognizable as human speech. "Current time is 11:47 p.m., October 15th. If anyone receives this recording, if anyone survives what's about to happen, you need to understand what we discovered down here." The building shuddered again as something passed beneath it, something so large that the entire research station felt like a toy boat floating on an infinite sea. Through the reinforced concrete floor, he could feel movement that operated according to principles of physics that human science had never encountered. The sounds from the deep ocean weren't communication between unknown species. They weren't territorial displays or mating calls or any other natural phenomenon we tried to categorize them as. They were systematic reconnaissance pulses, echolocation signals, being used to map every detail of our world. Outside, the water was receding from the coastline at a rate that defied every law of fluid dynamics Kellerman understood. In minutes, the ocean pulled back for miles, exposing seafloor that hadn't seen air since the Cretaceous period. Ancient sediments and fossilized remains were revealed in the sudden absence of water, creating a moonscape of geological history that stretched to the horizon. "Something has been using our oceans as a sensing system," he continued, fighting to keep his voice steady as the magnitude of their situation became clear. "Mapping our shipping routes, our underwater installations, our military activities. Learning about us the way marine biologists study dolphin behavior, except these entities have been conducting their research for millions of years." In the distance, silhouettes that belonged in nightmares rather than natural history were breaching the surface of the retreating ocean. They moved with grace that spoke of eons spent perfecting three-dimensional locomotion through environments where pressure and temperature would instantly kill any terrestrial life form. As they rose, the displaced water had to go somewhere, and Kellerman realized with mounting horror that it was flowing inland like a reverse tsunami, carrying with it the chemical signatures of the deep ocean and biological materials that had never been exposed to surface conditions. "The ocean level isn't dropping because of some geological catastrophe," he whispered into his microphone, watching through the windows as walls of water advanced toward the shore with the inexorable patience of glacial movements. "It's dropping because the ocean is being relocated. Whatever was down there, it wasn't living in our ocean. Our ocean was just the shallow surface layer of something else entirely." The thrumming sound returned, but now it came from above rather than below. The air itself was vibrating with frequencies that made his vision blur and his inner ear lose all sense of spatial orientation. As he looked up through the reinforced skylights, shapes blocked out the storm clouds, forms so vast and geometrically impossible that his mind struggled to process what he was seeing without completely surrendering to catatonic terror. "The sounds we thought were coming from the ocean floor," he gasped into the microphone as his equipment began to spark and fail around him. "They were never coming from below us. They were coming from inside something that we've been living on top of without ever realizing it. Through the chaos of wind and rising water, through the impossible geometry of things that shouldn't exist, ascending from depths that had never truly been empty, David Kellerman finally understood the truth that would die with him in the next few minutes. Earth wasn't humanity's planet that happened to have deep oceans covering most of its surface. It was their planet, and humans had simply been temporary passengers, floating on the surface tension of something far older, far larger, and far more intelligent than they could have imagined in their most fevered nightmares. The Pacific Ocean hadn't been hiding ancient sea creatures in its deepest trenches. The Pacific Ocean had been the circulatory system of a single, unimaginably vast organism that was finally stirring to full consciousness after 65 million years of dormancy. "We thought we were studying marine life," Kellerman whispered as his recording equipment began to smoke and fail. "But we were never marine biologists. We were microbes living in the bloodstream of something that was patient enough to let us think we owned the surface of its body." The last sound his instruments recorded before the building was swept away by waters that tasted of primordial chemistry and alien biology, was not the crash of waves or the howl of hurricane winds, but the gentle rhythm of something unimaginably vast drawing its first conscious breath in geological ages. In that sound was patience that spanned eras, intelligence that had been dreaming through the rise and fall of entire evolutionary epochs, and a sense of awakening purpose that rendered humanity's brief tenancy on the surface as insignificant as the life cycle of mayflies. As the recording equipment was finally destroyed, carried away by currents that followed new laws of physics, dictated by a consciousness that predated complex life on Earth, the Pacific Ocean began to reorganize itself around presences that were reshaping the very geography of the planet according to plans that had been forming since before the first vertebrates crawled onto land. The age of humanity's dominion over the oceans was ending, not with warfare or natural catastrophe, but with the simple awakening of an entity that had finally decided to terminate its long period of observation and begin the next phase of its existence. In the darkness that followed, as continents shifted and sea levels found new equilibrium around anatomical structures too large for human minds to properly conceive, the Earth itself began to remember what it had been like before the surface-dwelling parasites had arrived to disturb its ancient sleep. And in the deepest places where pressure and time held no meaning for consciousnesses that operated on planetary scales, other sounds were beginning to stir. Responses to signals that had been transmitted not through water or air, but through the quantum foam that underlies the fabric of space-time itself. The awakening Earth had been just the first movement in a symphony that spanned galaxies, and now other worlds were beginning to hear the music and add their own voices to the cosmic composition that would reshape the universe according to principles that no human science had ever suspected might exist. In the days that followed, as the few surviving humans struggled to comprehend a world where the ocean had become something alive and aware, radio telescopes that still functioned began detecting similar acoustic signatures from the direction of Europa, Enceladus, and dozens of other worlds where liquid water had been thought to be nothing more than a geological phenomenon. The universe was waking up, and humanity was about to learn that they had never been alone in their cosmic neighborhood. They had simply been too small and too brief to notice the vast intelligences that had been slumbering all around them, waiting for the right moment to open their planetary eyes and stretch limbs that spanned solar systems. The sounds coming from the ocean floor had indeed been getting louder, but not because something was approaching from the depths. They had been getting louder because something that had always been there was finally ready to make itself known to the microscopic creatures that had been skittering across its surface like bacteria on the skin of a sleeping giant. And now that the giant was awake, it was time for a conversation that would redefine the very meaning of life in the universe.